Welcome back, and thank you all for joining us for episode 21 of the 24-hour Refinitiv Perspectives live event. Joining us for this conversation on stranded assets and due diligence is David Lubin, who is Senior Advisor for Signal ESG, and Charlie Minutella, who is Head of Enhanced Due Diligence at Refinitiv. So nice to have you both.
Good to be here.
And great pleasure.
Yeah, so Charlie, we kind of have this first question for you. We've heard so much today on these outlooks for 2021 about the need for greater due diligence to understand and measure evolving business risks. How is your work adding to a better understanding of company level sustainability related risk profiles?
Sure. So we're seeing the greatest application of due diligence really hitting the supply chain side of things, and that's to be expected given all that's happened in 2021 or 2020 into 2021. So we're seeing that companies are sort of largely in three buckets. One is they're trying to stabilize their supply chain. So industries like retail are monitoring the progression of their suppliers coming back online and returning to levels of production they saw pre-pandemic. And there's fits and starts in a lot of instances there where suppliers will return to levels of normality, and then because of some sort of mandate or labor shortage or whatever, that production changes. And so they're continuing to find ways to fill the gaps as best they can. But we see it, when we go to the stores, that not everything is always on the shelf. Another thing that's happening in the stabilization side of things is around remediation. So we saw a lot of suppliers being onboarded very quickly. We saw it in the private sector, we saw it in the public sector. Governments, companies were trying to get supplies however they could. And so there was a lot of rush in that process. And so companies are now going back and making sure that they've done the right type of risk assessment on the suppliers, potentially amending risk ratings and contracts as needed. But there is that level of trying to get to a place where they feel confident that their supply chain is at a place of stability. The second is those that have come out a bit ahead of that are building supply chain resilience. And so we're seeing an expansion of supply chains. There's a lot of discussion in various industries around going to a location plus one model. So if you are highly dependent on a company or a country for specific parts of your supply chain, amending that approach and going to a second location, that introduces a whole lot of risk in the sense that companies are going into countries for the first time, may not understand the local landscape as well as they should, and are beginning to put business relationships in place. We're seeing that they're identifying risks in a more structured way. So those types of companies that are building resilience are beginning to more actively manage reputational risk, operational risk, financial and credit risk, because they need to make sure that these suppliers are staying in business. And then obviously the changing landscape from a geopolitical perspective, countries that are experiencing issues and those that are being sanctioned. So the whole goal is to build a more structured, risk-based approach that takes the things that are going to affect the supply chain and really puts a program in place to more tightly manage them. And then finally, the companies that are really ahead of the game are building sustainable supply chains, and where they're beginning to really tie their supply chain to their corporate social responsibility goals. And it's really interesting that this became such a hot topic in 2020, given everything that was going on. Companies that were performing the best were the ones that were really driving sustainability as the big part of their agenda. And we saw it just last weekend. Apple announced that they're going to align executive comp to ESG performance, which I think is really interesting because it really gives people within companies incentive to really drive sustainability within the company, and the payout can swing their bonus 10%. So it's real money. And they talked about, obviously their environmental record, and that's, Apple, continues to drive improved environmental performance, particularly in their supply chain. But they also talked about labor and human rights issues. They want their supply chains to operate, partners to operate in ways that they do themselves in their own direct operations. So these are the big issues for 2021, and the ability to actually, work with your suppliers, understand them, collect information about them, and do it in a way that that you can in terms of it being cost effective, but also in a way in which you could drive better outcomes for the company. Those are all really big themes for the year.
That's great, Charlie. I think I can pick right up from where you left off and give the listeners almost a kind of a flip side of what you were just talking about. In the sustainability work that's been done broadly, there's been a lot of discussion about stranded assets. Up until now, much of that, and for those who aren't familiar with the concept, it's assets that a company owns that largely for external factors may suffer some unanticipated or premature write-down or even complete write-off, resulting in material losses for the businesses. And to date, organizations like Carbon Tracker in the UK have focused the stranded asset analysis largely on tangible assets, like in their case, like oil, gas, and coal reserves, arguing that they may become stranded because of changing market and regulatory conditions. Those assets may never be utilized. They may never reach the market. And by a lot of estimates, these are big numbers. That it's a third of all proven reserves of oil, half the gas, and more than 3/4 of the coal. Trillions and trillions. But today I want to take a page out of Charlie, out of your book, and talk about something that hasn't really been discussed, and that's stranded intangible assets. These are the assets like patents and copyrights, proprietary product design, supplier networks, customer lists, brands, and goodwill. And here too, sustainability factors like climate change, but not limited to climate change, can greatly diminish and potentially strand intangible assets in ways that aren't dissimilar to the stranding of tangible assets. And so for a company, if what your intangibles know how to produce and sell aren't aligned to key sustainability themes, you can get stuck with a whole bunch of stranded assets. And I, just hearing what you were just saying, I was trying to take a look at the global fashion industry. Not something that I know a whole lot about. But I went to Vogue Business, which is an absolutely wonderful resource, which I didn't know existed. And from there I learned that, of course, I knew that the fashion industry relies heavily on Chinese cotton, about 85% of which today comes from the Xinjiang region, which is, as I think many of us know, is embroiled in tremendous controversy about forced labor conditions, the sorts of conditions that impinged on Apple's good name just a few years ago. And what we know, what Vogue tells us, is that very few of those big brands have much visibility into the origins of their materials. They have some visibility into their first and second tier suppliers, but almost no visibility into the third and fourth tier. It drops down considerably. Yet customers are saying, we want assurances, and these supplier networks represent very significant intangible assets in the fashion industry, and those companies are being forced to either rebuild, reimagine and rebuild those networks, just as you were describing, Charlie, or they risk, damaging an even bigger intangible, which is their brand.
Right.
And so, you might, Caroline, you might be wondering how big this problem is.
Yes.
Is this a Is this a little issue or a big issue? Well, here, if you look back just a little ways, back, a little ways to me, probably pretty long to you, 1985. 1985, 2/3 of the asset value of the S&P 500 came from tangible assets. Only 1/3 of the assets were in the intangible category. If you look, the last time I pulled this data up was 2018. In 2018, 80% of the asset value of the S&P 500 came from intangibles, not from the plants and equipment, came from all the intangibles. And those assets are at risk. And you need smart guys like Charlie to be able to tell you how much risk as you think about these sustainability imperatives that companies are facing.
Yeah, and bringing that to risk, Charlie, we're going to go back to you. So obviously the launch of virtual offices has completely changed the game on risk and added a whole new form and of risk coming in. So how do companies manage this new risk while considering data protection and other relevant regulations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the quote that's sort of out there is there's been 10 years of technology adoption, and it happened in the first few months after the pandemic really set in. And what does that mean? There's a lot of people working remotely. They're working on personal devices. They're working in networks that may not be secure, and it's happening all over the world, and it's happening in every industry. So no one's immune to it. And with this, there's been a massive pickup in organized cybercrime. So the number of email phishing initiatives continues to rise, and the ransomware and things along those lines that are driving really uncomfortable situations for companies and individuals continue to prevail. And we actually we think about that, and it may sound like somewhat victimless, but in one area, an IBM recently published a research report on this. There's a massive amount of cyber crime activity going on in the vaccine space. So the IBM research report talked about an organized attack on what they're calling the cold chain. So the supply chain that's responsible for getting the vaccines that need to be kept at -94 degrees Fahrenheit to the places where they could be administered to you and I. And why is that? Well, there's a lot of value in those vaccines. There's a lot of value for people that want to get access to those vaccines, have those vaccines. Companies that want to be able to actually, or countries that want to actually be able to build the refrigeration for those vaccines. And so it's a prime target, high risk, going so quickly, the controls may not be catching up with the execution. And so that's a big area of risk. Another big area is the actual companies that are doing the research. So those that are doing the testing, those that are researching, the various vaccines that are in play at the moment, looking to steal that data, and that's largely been state-backed. So it's the actors you would expect. So those are all areas of real significant risk, and what we're seeing is when we think about this from a supply chain perspective is for most suppliers, they weren't historically looked at as really carrying sensitive data, and their sort of natural controls were enough to kind of keep the data safe. But in a world where we are today, things have changed considerably, and the way that companies and governments look at IP being protected, personal data being protected, trade secrets being protected, they're really looking hard at ways in which they can get better indicators of whether or not who they're doing business with are really keeping up with their cyber and technology obligations. So this is an area that I think is a big theme for 2021. I see this as being just as big an issue as doing business with a company that's sanctioned, on that scale, where every company checks to see if their trading partner is sanctioned. And now they're likely going to do some sort of technology and cyber risk assessment because the stakes are so great and the risk is so high.
Yeah, and we've seen this theme of the need for transparency in a few of our other lives, and how, especially with the online work from home environment, it's become harder and harder to get there. But David, we're going to go back to you. So your team has recently released an in-depth look at the transformation getting underway in the auto sector. Is there a potential for stranded intangible assets in the auto sector, and how are you measuring company-level climate-related risks and opportunities?
That's a mouthful, but we've been working on that
Yes.
issue with our partners at Refinitiv. Yeah, I mean, the question we were trying to address is to try to develop some kind of proxy where we could get a real measurement based on real data, and very importantly, not only ESG data, which is valuable, but what we really believe is critical is integrating real industrial benchmarking production data. So not only do we know what the company says it aspires to be, through its ESG reporting, what its processes are or its policies, we wanted to know, what are they actually building? What are they producing? So for us, and what that meant for us is that we wanted to know how ready the major automakers were to put to work all those intangible assets needed to build a transformed fleet of cars and trucks for the new market that's emerging. And we decided to calculate something we called the sustainable value ratio for each of those major automakers, where the numerator represented the readiness of the company to exploit the transition opportunity toward low carbon vehicles. And it took us, we built a composite of different factors: their current sales of those advanced vehicles, their production plans for their announced production plans for increases, their sales momentum of those types of vehicles, electric or battery hybrids, and we looked at their R&D spend and and importantly their actual progress of reducing emissions on the cars that they produced. And on the denominator, we wanted to measure the risks, the risks that they faced, including the total footprint of their emissions, their dependence on big fossil fuel powered SUVs to produce sales and profits, and the regulatory risks that they faced in each of the regions where they operated, and importantly, their level of transparency and disclosure to the public. And by making a ratio of those two, the opportunity to risk ratio, we really saw a very revealing picture. Of course, it didn't take a genius to know that Tesla would come out on top, but there were a couple of Chinese car makers, BAIC and BYD, who together sell as many electric vehicles a year as Tesla does. Interesting. And when we compute their, the risk, the opportunity to risk ratio for those car makers, we're in the sort of 10 to 1, 5 to 1 range. Opportunity way out pacing risk. Then you look at companies, and we did this for all 26 of the major automakers around the world. You look at companies like Renault and BMW. BMW has been a bit slow in comparison to other automakers to really invest in and commit to electrification. And there the ratio is more like 1 to 1. But then you look at companies like Fiat Chrysler, who I know just changed their name, but I haven't figured out how to pronounce it yet. And companies like Tata in India. And there it's the reverse. The ratio is more like 1 to 10. At present, based on the assets that they are putting to work, they got a lot of risk in these coming years. They're going to have to really pour energy into catching up to the marketplace. So it gives us a real opportunity to get a sense of how those intangible assets, for some companies, are geared more to the past than to the future. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, it's been so interesting to learn more about these intangible assets and how they play, and then also to learn more about the risks that companies are going to have to look into 2021. I mean, we're not going away from the virtual office, I think, anytime soon. So just continuing to learn and go forward with that. But it's been so great to have you both. Thank you for the conversation.
Great pleasure on our end, I'm sure.
Thank you. So if you've enjoyed this episode, you can read a report on third-party risk by scanning the code or going to the link on the screen now. As always, thank you for joining us, and be sure to stay tuned for the next episode, which is about digitization and optimization in 2021. See you in an hour.